January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The frozen earth cracked beneath the boots of Oberst Friedrich Wolf as he surveyed the American positions through frost-covered binoculars. Dawn had not yet broken, but the mechanics of war never slept. He had been watching these particular enemy lines for 11 days, memorizing patrol patterns, noting the placement of machine gun nests, tracking the rhythms of their supply convoys. In the brutal calculus of winter warfare, knowledge of your enemy's disposition meant survival, yet something impossible was unfolding before his eyes. The Americans he had catalogued so meticulously were leaving, not retreating, leaving, and in their place, fresh soldiers arrived with the casual efficiency of factory workers changing shifts. Wolf lowered his binoculars, breath-forming clouds in the bitter air. In 23 years of military service, he had never witnessed such a thing. Armies did not simply rotate exhausted men out of active combat positions while maintaining offensive pressure. It defied every principle of military doctrine he had learned at the Kriegsakademie. An army was not a machine where components could be swapped at will. Soldiers under fire became irreplaceable repositories of tactical knowledge, understanding the terrain, knowing where the enemy concentrated his strength, recognizing the subtle sounds that meant danger. To remove them was to blind yourself deliberately. But the Americans were doing exactly that. The German officer corps had entered this war with certain unshakable assumptions about industrial warfare. They had studied the Great War's grinding stalemate and concluded that modern conflict demanded ruthless efficiency, squeezing maximum combat effectiveness from every available man until he could give no more. The concept was brutal but logical. In total war, sentiment was a luxury. The Wehrmacht's doctrine called for units to fight until rendered combat ineffective through casualties or exhaustion, then be withdrawn for reconstitution. Soldiers might spend months in continuous frontline service sustained by iron discipline and the faint promise of eventual relief. This was the price of military excellence. The Americans, it seemed, had written an entirely different manual. Wolf's intelligence reports painted a picture that challenged everything he understood about maintaining an offensive. American units were being rotated out of the line after periods as short as 2 to 3 weeks of sustained combat, not because they had been shattered by casualties, not because they had broken under pressure, simply because staff officers in the rear had determined that their effectiveness was beginning to decline. The exhausted battalions would be pulled back to rest areas actual rest, with hot food, showers, dry clothes, and sleep in beds with mattresses. Meanwhile, fresh units moved forward without any apparent loss in operational momentum. It was madness or genius. Wolf could not yet determine which. The German army had expected to face a wealthy but soft adversary, a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers who might possess industrial capacity but lacked the warrior's essential hardness. America, with its jazz music and motion pictures, seemed to represent everything decadent about liberal democracy. How could such a society produce soldiers capable of matching men forged in the fires of ideological commitment and iron discipline? The assumption ran deep through Wehrmacht officer ranks. American troops might be well equipped, but they would lack staying power. They would break when pushed hard enough. The Ardennes offensive was designed partly to test this assumption. Hit them hard, hit them fast, create chaos, and watch the Americans crumble as their poorly trained conscripts abandoned positions and equipment. Oberst Wolf had been among the officers who believed victory was possible, that American morale would shatter like thin ice under the hammer blow of determined assault. Instead, he was watching an army that treated soldiers as valuable assets to be carefully maintained rather than consumable resources to be expended. The mechanism of American rotation was dizzyingly complex. Entire regiments would be extracted from active sectors and transported to rear areas, while replacement units, not hastily assembled scratch formations, but fully trained and equipped divisions, moved forward to occupy the same position. The transition occurred with such smoothness that German intelligence officers initially believed they were observing some form of elaborate deception. Surely the same units were simply being renumbered. cycled through positions to create the illusion of endless reinforcement. But prisoner interrogations confirmed the impossible truth. The exhausted soldiers being pulled from the line truly were being sent back for rest and refit, and the fresh-faced replacements really were new units, sometimes arriving directly from training grounds in England or even the continental United States. The Americans were conducting a systematic rotation of their entire front line combat strength while simultaneously maintaining offensive pressure. General Major Hans Speidel, serving on Rommel's staff before the invasion, and later documenting the Western Front camp, recorded his bewilderment in post-war testimony. "We calculated American strength based on divisions in the line, but their divisions seemed to multiply beyond accounting. A unit we had identified as exhausted would suddenly display the energy of fresh troops. We eventually understood they were fresh troops. The Americans possessed such abundance of manpower and transport that they could rotate entire divisions as if changing the guard at a palace. The practical implications were devastating to German defensive planning. Traditional doctrine held that an attacker's momentum would naturally decline as casualties accumulated and fatigue degraded effectiveness. Defenders could calculate how long an enemy offensive could be sustained before exhaustion forced a pause. This predictable rhythm allowed for counterattack planning and strategic patience. Against the Americans, such calculations became worthless. Their offensives did not exhaust themselves. Battalions that should have been worn down to ineffectiveness would suddenly display the vigor of units in their first days of combat, because they were units in their first days of combat. Wolfe had witnessed this phenomenon repeatedly since the Allied breakout from Normandy. His own unit had been fighting continuously since June of 1944. Same men enduring month after month of combat with only the briefest respites. They had become ghosts of themselves, hollow-eyed, prone to strange silences, jumping at unexpected sounds. The Wehrmacht still functioned because discipline held and because no alternative existed, but effectiveness declined in ways both obvious and subtle. Reaction times slowed. Tactical decisions became conservative, driven by exhaustion rather than strategic thinking. The aggressive spirit that won battles drained away, replaced by the grim determination merely to survive another day. The Americans across the line showed no such degradation, or rather, they did, but only briefly, before being rotated out and replaced. The logic behind the American system was rooted not in military tradition but in industrial management theory. Studies conducted during the Great War had demonstrated that worker productivity declined sharply after extended periods without rest. The same principles applied to soldiers. Men under sustained combat stress experienced measurable degradation in decision-making ability, reaction speed, and combat effectiveness. Traditional military culture viewed this as a test of character. Weak men broke, strong men endured. The Americans viewed it as an engineering problem requiring systematic solution. The solution was rotation. If soldiers could be extracted before reaching the point of complete exhaustion, they could be rested, restored, and returned to duty still possessing their full combat value. The investment in transportation, coordination, and temporary loss of experienced personnel would be offset by maintaining a consistently high level of effectiveness across the entire force. It was the application of assembly line thinking to human warfare maintenance schedules for valuable machinery. But it required resources on a scale that staggered the German imagination. The rotation system demanded thousands of trucks, hundreds of trains, countless gallons of fuel, all dedicated to the seemingly non-essential task of moving rested soldiers forward while moving tired soldiers backward. In the Wehrmacht's economy of scarcity, such expenditure was unthinkable. Every liter of gasoline, every ton of supplies, had to serve immediate tactical necessity. The idea of burning fuel simply to improve soldier morale seemed like strategic insanity. Yet it worked. Japanese officers observing American operations in the Pacific had reached similar conclusions, their reports filtering back to Berlin through neutral channels. Vice Admiral Matami Ugaki, serving on Yamamoto's staff, recorded in his diary a telling observation after examining captured American supply manifests. They rotate men as we rotate shifts in a factory. The exhausted are sent home or to rear areas while fresh soldiers arrive with disturbing regularity. We face not an army but a system one that treats individual soldiers as too valuable to discard casually. This is either their greatest weakness or their greatest strength. I have not determined which. The symbolic heart of the American rotation system revealed itself in the rest areas themselves. Oberst Wolf had interrogated enough prisoners to piece together a picture that seemed more fantasy than military reality. American soldiers pulled from the line were transported to camp, featuring hot showers, clean uniforms, actual beds with sheets and pillows. They received mail from home, watched motion pictures, ate meals prepared by dedicated cooks rather than heating rations in foxholes. Some rest areas even featured military bands and organized recreation. To German soldiers who considered themselves fortunate to receive a few days' respite in a partially destroyed village, such luxury seemed impossible. Wolf himself had not slept in a proper bed since the autumn of 1943. His men washed when circumstances permitted, ate cold rations more often than hot meals, and considered any position not under direct artillery fire to be a rest area. The contrast spoke to something deeper than mere logistics. It reflected a fundamental difference in how each society valued its soldiers' lives. The Americans, it appeared, genuinely believed their soldiers were worth preserving, not because of some abstract humanitarian sentiment, but because trained soldiers represented significant investment that should not be wasted through neglect. The rotation system embodied a distinctly American logic. Abundance carefully managed produced better results than scarcity heroically endured. This philosophical difference manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into strategic advantage. American soldiers fought with the knowledge that relief was coming, that they would not be ground down endlessly until death or serious wounds provided the only escape. This assurance did not make them soft. If anything, it enabled a certain calculated aggression. Men who knew they would survive to be rotated out could afford to take necessary tactical risks rather than hoarding their lives in desperate conservation. Conversely, German soldiers fought with increasing fatalism, knowing that only total collapse of their unit or catastrophic injury would earn them respite. The psychological impact was documented in after-action reports from both sides. American officers noted that rotated units maintained aggressive patrolling and offensive spirit throughout their time in the line, knowing relief approached. Wehrmacht officers increasingly struggled with passive defensive mindsets, as exhausted soldiers focused on survival rather than tactical initiative. The Americans built their system on hope and management. The Germans relied on discipline and endurance. One was sustainable, the other was not. By early 1945, the cumulative effect was becoming clear. The Wehrmacht's best remaining divisions were shadows of their former strength, not primarily from casualty, though those had been severe, but from the grinding exhaustion of men pushed beyond sustainable limits. Units would fight with desperate skill one day, then prove incapable of basic operations the next. The human machinery was breaking down, stripped gears failing in sequence. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained consistent pressure. Divisions rotated in and out of the line with mechanical regularity, each fresh unit bringing new energy to the offensive. Individual soldiers might be green, lacking the veterans' hard-won tactical knowledge, but they were rested, alert, properly fed and equipped. They could execute complex operations that exhausted troops would fumble, and they knew that in 2 or 3 weeks they too would be pulled back for rest and replacement. Oberst Wolf understood the implications even as he struggled to counter them. The Americans had created a system that turned their greatest apparent weakness, the soft individualism of democratic society, into strategic advantage. They could not match the Wehrmacht's traditional martial virtues of individual hardness and ideological commitment, so they had built a machine that did not require such qualities. The system carried soldiers through combat's worst trials not through superior warrior spirit, but through careful management and industrial-scale support. It was a deeply democratic vision of warfare, not the glory of individual heroes, but the power of organized society protecting its citizens even as it sent them into battle. Every rotated soldier represented a promise kept. We will not waste you. You are valuable. Your life matters beyond this moment's tactical necessity. The final irony was inescapable. The totalitarian state, which claimed to represent perfect organization and efficiency, was being out-organized by a liberal democracy. The society supposedly made soft by individual rights and material abundance was demonstrated. Superior ability to sustain coordinated violence over extended campaigns. The Americans had industrialized combat sustainment with the same ruthless efficiency they had brought to automobile manufacturing, and with similar results. Wolfe raised his binoculars again, watching fresh American troops move into positions evacuated hours before by exhausted men. In the growing light he could see them laughing, passing cigarettes, moving with the easy confidence of soldiers who knew they were not being sacrificed pointlessly. Behind them, an endless chain of supply trucks rolled forward, bringing ammunition, food, fuel, and eventually, relief. The war was already lost. Wolfe had known this since the failure of the Ardennes offensive, perhaps even before, but watching the American rotation system operate with mechanical precision, he understood something more profound. Germany had not simply been outfought or outproduced. It had been outthought at the most fundamental level of military philosophy. The Americans had discovered that in industrial warfare, sustainability mattered more than momentary superiority. That careful management of human resources could defeat theoretical martial excellence. In the frozen forests of Belgium, as dawn finally broke over exhausted armies, the future of warfare was revealing itself, not in dramatic charges or heroic last stands, but in logistics, spreadsheets, and rotation schedules. In the understanding that soldiers, like any valuable resource, performed best when properly maintained. In the recognition that abundance carefully applied could overcome scarcity heroically endured. The Americans rotated their units without losing momentum, and in that simple administrative achievement lay the death sentence of every military power that still believed wars were won through superior warrior spirit alone. The age of industrial war demanded industrial solutions. Democracy, it turned out, could provide them more efficiently than any competing system. Wolfe lowered his binoculars and turned toward his own lines, where exhausted men waited for relief that would never come.